Right, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to those of you who are coming to see my next video on the murder of Mary Ann Nichols. What we're about to do now is just pass through the ticket barrier at Whitechapel Underground Station. So here we go. Right, now then, let's say welcome back. For those who don't know me, my name is Magnus Nielsen, and I use the YouTube channel called Lord Londonstone. And what I am doing at the present moment is making a series of videos on the murders that were committed in this district in the year 1888 by an undetected serial murderer known to history as Jack the Ripper. So, as I say, what I am at the present moment, I am in Whitechapel Underground Station, just coming out of the station at the present moment into the Whitechapel Road. What I propose to do now is just turn the screen around so you can think about. Here we are, we're now just leaving the station again. And right, just turn around to the right-hand side. I'm making my way westward along the north side of Whitechapel Road. And as you may recall from my video about Martha Tabram, I went into the beginning of the story about the last few weeks of the life of Mary Ann Nichols. And I said how she'd been living in the various doss houses in Spitalfields, and that on the evening of the 30th of August, she'd been in the Frying Pan pub. She went back, she was out of money, completely penniless, and she went back to a common lodging house and to try and plead for a free bed. They wouldn't give it to her, so she then had to go out into the streets of the locality to look for a customer. And we left her at 2:30 in the morning talking to her friend Emily Holland on the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel High Street. And that was, as I said, at 2:30. Anyway, this is, come back to the present for the time being, this is Whitechapel Market. And if I turn around here to show you the south side of Whitechapel Road, you'll see this building directly in front of us. This building directly in front of us is now the Tower Hamlets Town Hall. It wasn't always Tower Hamlets Town Hall, it's only been Tower Hamlets Town Hall since 2015. Before that, this building was the London Hospital, now called the Royal London Hospital. And this edifice here, if I can just show you, is a monument which was put up by the Jewish community in 1911 in honour of King Edward VII, the King and Emperor. There was as I think I mentioned before, there was a very large Jewish community in this area. They've all moved out. You can see also here what they have done is that they've had drinking fountains, which the idea was to provide fresh water to anybody who felt thirsty. Free of charge, of course, but no longer working. Okay, now what I've done, just turned round and I'm heading east. And as I make my way a little bit further forward, just over here on the left hand side, you're going to see Wood's buildings. And I point this out to you because this, they've actually got the door open. Wood's buildings, there was a passageway here that you could freely go down to get into Durward Street or Bucks Row. And I believe that Mary Ann Nichols met the person we call Jack the Ripper here, or somebody very close here, probably around about 3:10, 3:15, and she took him off. She went down Woods Buildings, down into what was then Bucks Row, we now call Durward Street. So I'll go to Durward Street. Since I can't go that way, I shall have to make my way further forward on the north side of the street, heading east. We carry on in this direction, we would go all the way to Mile End, and then beyond Mile End we'd go to Stratford, but we don't want to go quite that far, it's not necessary. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me just turn back a bit so you can see my face. Right, just make our way just a little bit further forward. And before I start talking a bit about Mary Ann Nichols and who she was, again, there is something I would like to show you here. And if I stand back, I think you'll get a much better view of it. It is the Working Lads Institute. Now, the Working Lads Institute was set up as a self-help foundation for young men in this locality in Victorian times, a place where they could get an education. And you'll see if we take a closer look at the doorway, they have a lecture hall. That was so you can develop your mind. They didn't just have a lecture hall, they also provided, if you look up there, you'll see a gymnasium. So they could develop their minds and develop their bodies at the same time, so they would become good citizens and good husbands, and of course they'd get themselves an education that would fit them up for a trade. Come back. Here we are now. Heading along, going down the market. As I say, there's a market here from Monday through to Saturday. It's not held on a Sunday. And what I can talk about a bit is Mary Ann Nichols, who is the subject of this video. Now, Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old at the time of her murder. So 43, she actually looked about 10 years younger. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall. She had dark hair, which was beginning to turn grey. She had a small scar on her forehead, and she was missing some teeth, about 3 teeth in her lower jaw. Now, at the time of her murder, she had no property other than the clothes that she was standing up in. She had several layers of clothing. She also had a comb and a piece of broken mirror and a handkerchief. No money. And that was Mary Ann Nichols, sometimes also known, as Polly Nichols. And she was the first of the Canonical Murders, probably the second of the murders committed by Jack the Ripper. Now turn around again. Here, just before we turn into Brady Street, I just want to point out these places, because this was the site of the home of Dr. Rhys Llewellyn, medical doctor who was called to attend to the dead body of Mary Ann Nichols. Anyway, we'll go further forward, and very shortly what we'll be doing is turning into Brady Street, and I propose to do that. We'll be turning north. If we were to carry on further in this direction, we wouldn't have to go very far till we came to a public house called the Blind Beggar, and there's been a public house on that site since 1654. The present building dates from 1894, and that was the public house which, sorry about this, let's see, 1894. Public house stood here since 1694. It's outside this pub in 1865 that William Booth delivered a fiery and impassioned sermon which led to the foundation of the Salvation Army. And also on the 9th of March 1966, it was a place where Ronnie Cray shot and murdered a man called George Cornell, who was a member of a rival gang of villains, in front of 20 witnesses, none of whom were prepared to give evidence. Anyway, here we are, ladies and gentlemen. Just turn around to the left-hand side. We're now in Brady Street, and we're walking along. Sorry about the jiggling around. I'm trying to cope with two things at once, so just bear with me on this. We'll head forward. Just a little way, because as we make our way down here, we come to the site of what used to be Winthrop Street leading off on the left. It's no longer there, but there was another street leading off here on the left hand side, and also very close by there was a horse slaughterers by the name of Harrison, Barber and Company. Now, as I say, we're talking about 1888, and in those days horses were used extensively to draw all the traffic around London. 1888 was the year when the first car, or at least I should say the first motor car, automobile, appeared on the streets of London, or at least the ancestor of motor cars. Until that time, all traffic was drawn around by horses, and there was a total of 300,000 horses on the streets of London. And you can think back and you might say, well, that's all rather wonderful, isn't it? I mean, you have the horses, a bit quaint, but at least there'd be no accidents and there'd be no pollution. And that's where you'd be wrong, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite easy to fall under the hooves of horses and be killed. And as for pollution, well, a single horse can produce 9 tons of horse manure in a year. And so if you multiply 300,000 by 9, you come to a figure of 27 million. That's 27 million tons of horse manure every year. That's a fantastic amount of horse manure. If you think about it, pile it all up, it makes a larger mound than St. Paul's Cathedral, I reckon. And that's just for 1 year. After 10, it's just unthinkable, isn't it? Anyway, we're heading up Brady Street, and just a little bit down here over on the left you will see a sign which shows Durward Street, and I'll just show you Durward Street. This is Durward Street. I'd just like to head up here just for a moment, because what I propose to do now is just talk about the events of that morning, early morning of Friday the 31st, and what I propose to do, of 31st of August, and what I propose to do is stay with the standard narrative. Now, there are alternative narratives, and I will discuss those alternative narratives on some other occasion. Oh, but before I do that, just round here, there was a pond. It's actually called a ducking pond, and what they used to do in those days, next to the ducking pond, they'd have a large seesaw contraption. They used to stick people on one end and duck them into the water. That was for committing minor crimes. And so they had a ducking pond here, and then they named the street that led up to it Ducking Pond Row, and then it became Bucks Row. Now, then it became Durward Street. Anyway, let's get back to the script. Sorry about that little digression. Charles Cross, who was a 39-year-old delivery man, lived in Bethnal Green. I'm not going to go all the way up to the place where he lived, but he used to make his daily walk to work from his home along these streets. He'd leave the house probably around about 3:30 with a view to getting to Liverpool Street Station about 4 o'clock, and you could do it actually if you walked briskly. What you did is you come down from home, you came all the way down here, and then you turn into Bucks Road. So he'd left home about 3:30, I reckon, and he arrived here around about 3:30. People didn't have watches on those days, so they just had to reckon the time by chiming clocks. Anyway, we've now turned into Durward Street. Talk a bit about Mary Ann Nichols. Now, she was born in 1845. She was the daughter of Edward Walker, who was either a blacksmith or a locksmith. We're not quite clear. There are different accounts of that. And she lived and grew up in the neighbourhood of Shoe Lane, which is off Fleet Street in the city of London, between Fleet Street and the Church of St Andrew, Holborn. In 1864, that's to say when she was 19 years old, she married a printer by the name of William Nichols in the Church of St Bride, Fleet Street, and she had 5 children by him. There were 3 sons and 2 daughters, and at the time of her death, the eldest son, Edward, was 22, so he was already a young man. Henry, however, was only 10. I should explain that Fleet Street was the centre of the printing industry, and had been for about 400 years or so. So not surprising that William Nichols would find his employment there. Anyway, the couple first lived in a place called Bovary Street, which is parallel to Fleet Street. And then they went off to Walworth, which is on the south bank of the River Thames. And then what they did is move to Peabody Buildings in Stamford Street. Sad to say that after the birth of Henry, the marriage fell apart, and there are different accounts of why that happened. It may have been because of Polly's drinking, or it could possibly have been the flirtation that William Nichols was having with the midwife after the birth of her last child. We don't know. It could have been that which drove Polly to drink, but anyway, we'll never know the story about that. But the point was, this is taking us to about 1880. For the next 8 years, Mary Ann was in and out of the workhouse, and we know that in 1887 she was sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, and that would be during the autumn. She returned to the workhouse for Christmas and stayed there for a few months, and then in May of 1888 somebody found her a job as a housekeeper for a couple who were living in Wandsworth. The couple's name was Samuel and Sarah Cowdray. They apparently didn't have children, or the children had flown the nest or whatever, and she was with them for about 6 weeks or so, and then she absconded with £3 10 shillings worth of clothes. That was on the 2nd of July, and having stolen the clothes, she then made straight for Thrall Street in Whitechapel. Now, I was talking again about Charles Cross. He came all the way down here and made his way along. It was dark. We're talking about 3:40 in the morning. Although it was August, it was dark. And as he came along here to the end, almost the end of Bucks Row, although it was dark, he could see something lying on the pavement, which he first took to be a piece of tarpaulin. And he thought that could be interesting, something that he might like to take for himself. It was just lying outside a stable yard. We went to investigate, but he quickly realised that he wasn't looking at a piece of tarpaulin. He was looking at the body of a woman who was lying on her back with skirts about her waist, and it wasn't clear to him at all whether she was dead or just drunk. And while he was pondering this matter, another man came up behind him, and his name was Robert Paul. He was another delivery man, also making his way to work. So Charles Cross asked him for help, and they went and had a look. They went to investigate. Now, they're still very uncertain. Charles Cross thought the woman was dead. Robert Paul thought that he could detect breathing. He touched the lady's face, she was still warm, and thought that she was still alive. But of course, I say, both of them had jobs to go to, and neither of them wanted to be late for work, so they headed off in the general direction of Hanbury Street, which is the way I'm going now. They just smoothed down the skirt just to give the lady a bit of dignity. While we're here, it's just worth having a good look at what used to be the old board school. This was built in 1876 for the local children who weren't able to play in the street. They had to play on the roof. That's why you have the railings around the roof. And this building was derelict for many, many years, and eventually it's now been converted into residential property. Anyway, about 3:45 we had a police officer, and his name was John Neal. He was coming this way, making his way along Bucks Row, and he'd been here about 30 minutes early, hadn't noticed anything unusual. But he had the advantage, which neither Charles Cross nor Robert Paul had. He had a lamp. So when he looked down at the body, he could see that somebody had cut her throat. Her body was lying lengthways along the pavement, with her head over on the left-hand side. She was lying on the flat of her back. Her eyes were wide open, her hands were open by her side, and the bonnet, which she'd taken such pride in, that was lying on the pavement close to her left hand. So Constable Neal then signalled to a colleague all the way down in Brady Street. It was Police Constable John Thane, and told him when he came here, he said, go and fetch Dr. Llewellyn. Now, having done that, just a minute or so after that, another police constable, John Thane, who was Police Constable Jonas Misen, who just received the information about the body in the gateway from Charles Cross and Robert Paul. He appeared on the scene, and so Constable Neal told him to go and notify the police at Bethnal Green Police Station. Constable Neal then investigated the possibility that the murder had taken place somewhere else, and the body had been brought here by a vehicle and then dumped on the side. But he investigated around here. He couldn't see the marks or any tracks of any car, and there were no signs of a trail of blood, so he ruled out that possibility. As he looked across the street, he could see a place called Essex Wharf. Now, this is all that now remains of Essex Wharf. Essex Wharf was simply a platform from which goods trains used to stop and load and unload the stuff that they were carrying. Anyway, the manager of Essex Wharf was a man called Walter Purkis, and so he knocked on the door. He knocked up Purkis to find out if he had actually was aware of anything going on. He wasn't. He said he'd heard nothing at all. By that time, Sergeant Henry Kirby from Bethnal Green Police Station arrived shortly afterwards, and they both went to ask a lady called Emma Green, who was living in a house there next to the stable yard, whether she'd heard anything, and she hadn't heard anything at all. Everything was in silence, and of course by this time Dr. Llewellyn had arrived. This would be about 4 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, he looked at the body and he confirmed that the lady was dead. He said the death had taken place about half an hour earlier. That would have been about 3:30. The story now had begun to circulate among the neighbourhood, and some workmen from the horse slaughterers came to investigate, and a small crowd was beginning to gather, and it was beginning to get light. So arrangements were made to remove the corpse to the local mortuary, and Constables Neal, Misen and Kirby then went with the ambulance. I say an ambulance was really just a cart which had been covered over with a piece of tarpaulin. And while Constable Thane waited here for Inspector Spratling. And while they were waiting, one of the sons of Emma Green, living in the house on this site, he was a man who worked in the stable yard. He threw a large bucket of water over the pavement and then got a broom and brushed away all the traces of blood. Of course, much of the blood had been absorbed by the clothing worn by Mary Ann Nichols. The point was that the local residents were uncomfortable about this place becoming a local attraction and a place of morbid interest. I'm afraid that didn't prevent, the fact just washing away blood didn't really do much to prevent that. Once the Jack the Ripper scandal had really become a thing in this neighbourhood, people used to come down here all the time, and eventually the people who were living in Bucks Row had to petition the local authority to change the name from Bucks Row to Durward Street, which is what it is now called. Anyway, Inspector Spratling went to the mortuary where the corpse of Mary Ann Nichols was waiting for him, and he had to wait for the mortuary attendant, Robert Mann, who arrived at 5:20 a.m. to open up the building. And then, as the body was being undressed, they discovered that Mary Ann Nichols had suffered serious wounds upon her abdomen. So Dr. Llewellyn had to return to make more detailed examination, and he performed the autopsy on the body the following morning, that being Saturday the 1st of September. Spent the entire morning on this job, and he concluded that her throat had been cut from left to right, two distinct cuts being on the left side, the windpipe, the gullet, the spinal cord had been cut through. A bruise, apparently that of a thumb, on the right jaw, and also one on the left cheek. Now, what was remarkable is that the abdomen had been cut open from the centre of the bottom of the ribs on the right side under the pelvis to the left of the stomach, and this wound was jagged. The coating of the stomach was cut in several places, and there were two small stabs on the private parts, done apparently with a strong bladed knife. And at the time, Dr. Llewellyn was of the opinion that those stabs had been committed by a left-handed person. Actually, he changed his mind a few weeks later and revised his opinions about the murder being necessarily left-hand. But he did think that the murderer had some rough anatomical knowledge, for he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts. And he also thought that the murder could have been executed in 4 or 5 minutes. Anyway, that was Saturday morning. The Saturday afternoon, they opened up the inquest at the Working Lads Institute. Now, what had happened was that they'd taken the clothes of Mary Ann Nichols, and among those clothes, some were marked with Lambeth Workhouse. So from that, they were able to work backwards to try and identify her. They got a name, the name being that of Mary Ann Nichols. So after that, they were able to trace her father, Edward Walker, and also her estranged husband, who came to the mortuary on the day after the inquest and made the formal identification. Right, where I am now is in a place called Valence Gardens, and what I propose to do is to carry on this talk a bit about the consequences of the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, and then I shall go into some general discussion about the historical context in which the murders took place. But just to talk a bit about this place, this was once upon a time, from 1687, it was a burial ground for the Quakers. Quakers make a point of just burying bodies in the ground. They don't put up any tombstones or any memorials. And so this was a burial ground for Quakers up until 1857. I suppose by that time it was full up, but if you were to start digging again, you'd probably find skeletons. Henrietta Barnett of Toynbee Hall in Commercial Street managed to persuade the appropriate authorities to turn this into an open space for the benefit of children, and that is, well, it's an open space really for the benefit of everyone. Anyway, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I propose to see you all again and continue this story in part 2.